Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Peter Pingitore, a descendant of Antonio Pingitore, a Kenosha police officer shot and killed in 1919. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for asking.
So, can you tell me how the Pingitores came to Kenosha? Was your grandfather the first?
He was the first in Kenosha, yes. He emigrated as a young boy, actually. Yeah. And we found out so much of this later. My grandmother, after my grandfather's murder, really never spoke to us about it. My uncles and aunts never spoke to us about it. We didn't think enough to ask too many questions. But anyway, we found out so much of this later through interviews with my Aunt Mary, her recollections, and through our own research and help that we received from local historians. So some of the more specific information I was able to generate from Ancestry. You know, his arrival date in the States was 1899. He was originally living in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania on the 1900 census. So he was 14 or 15, working as a slate picker in a mine in Schuylkill County. A few years later, he emigrated, or he moved further west to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where his brother Peter was living. And he was mining there. There was a bad mine explosion in 1902, and he was there. It was called the Rolling Mill Mine Disaster. Over 100 miners were killed. He later told my Aunt Mary that he lost his interest in mining pretty quickly. One of the stories that she recollects from him telling was that during that mine cave, that mine disaster, he ended up holding the hand of a young boy who was trapped and comforting him until help could come. And after that, he said, "I've had it with mining."
And that boy survived?
That I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, he ended up then coming to Kenosha. His son Frank was born in Johnstown, came to Kenosha, and I'm assuming, like most immigrant families, he was hearing of jobs. Got a job at Chicago Brass, worked there for a season, and then became a plumber. And he worked with Giorgio Principi as an apprentice plumber and received his master plumber's license in 1913, which was the year he also was naturalized as an American citizen. So.
And where did he come from originally?
He came from a small town quite west of Cosenza in Calabria called Petavigliano. And my siblings have visited and said it's quite mountainous there, dry mountainous area, pretty area. But he had 7 siblings. Some came to the States, his brother Pete in Johnstown, and a sister Rose who stayed in Johnstown as well, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. So he had an interest in law enforcement, and he did some moonlighting with both the police department in Kenosha and the sheriff's department, and then was hired as a Kenosha police officer in 1914. What's been interesting for me is I spent some time reading the Kenosha news articles. I haven't gone all the way from 1914 to 1919. But anyway, there were a couple of real interesting cases that he figured prominently in solving, usually involving Italian immigrants, you know, people who couldn't speak English, they spoke Italian. And, you know, he helped out until his untimely murder.
When was he actually hired as a police officer then?
1914.
Okay. Okay, so tell me, there was a book written.
Mm-hmm.
How did this book come about? Where did it start from? Where's the origin of that?
Well, again, my grandmother, when I was a youth, she passed away when I was about 13, I think 13 or 14. When I was born, we were living in the house on 54th Street. That was her house, my parents and my 4 siblings. And, but she had begun to revert back to speaking only Italian. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity, nor did I avail myself of the opportunity to really have meaningful conversations with her, unfortunately. But she had a picture on the wall of my grandfather with the city proclamation. It's framed up real nice on the wall. But again, you know, as a young boy, my siblings, we've told the same story. You'd go and look at it and you'd say, who was this? Well, that was your grandfather. Oh, okay. You know, but we really never probed any further. My uncle Frank, who was 13 when my grandfather was killed, my Aunt Mary, who was 11, they were probably the only two, perhaps Jenny, she was about 9, who would have many recollections about that period, that tragic period for them. We never asked our Uncle Frank much, and he wasn't real eager to share, you know. Anyway, my Aunt Rose had an old police gazette that she gave me one day, and some pictures that she had collected. The police gazette had an article called "If You Like Poison," and it was one of those stories. But later on, we discovered it wasn't super accurate. But anyway, cousin Joe Gallo, was a professor of English at Foothill College in California, Johnstown. I'm going to confuse that now. San Jose, California. And he visited Kenosha regularly. He loved Kenosha. He grew up in Kenosha and had a deep affection for the Columbus Park area. And we got to talking one day, and we talked about just this, oral history. And he began then to speak to his mother and gather her recollections. At about the same time, the Kenosha History Center, John had a display on Italians in Kenosha. And Superintendent of Schools John Husmanic had written a pamphlet on a hometown hero or Kenosha hero, and it was information about my grandfather. And he stopped me at a meeting once and said, are you related to the police officer who was killed? And I said, it's just my grandfather. And he said, I have something for you. And 2 days later, he gave me a huge binder of all of the Kenosha news articles that he had copied in his own research. John has done a comprehensive history of the schooling in Kenosha that is yet to be published, but he had all these newspaper articles from the beginning of the incident, the murder of my grandfather, and all the way, I think, to 1956. Anytime he ran across a Pingitore name, he had copied it. I gave that to my cousin Joe. Meanwhile, Don Jensen, a reporter for the Kenosha News, did a 3-part series, I believe, on the crime of the century, and did a lot of great research. So we were discovering the background, and my cousin then put together this wonderful book, The House on Garden Street, that tells a bit of the story of the murder and the pursuit of the murderers, as well as, he called it, was it in the vein of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, you know, taking an incident and trying to put dialogue, you know, to the narrative. And that's what he did with The House on Garden Street.
Could you give me a brief summary as to the circumstances of the murder?
My grandfather was, another very interesting fact that we discovered later, he was not supposed to be on duty that night. Another officer had gotten sick. I think my brother heard from his granddaughter that troubled him for the rest of his life, that my grandfather was killed that night because he was supposed to be on duty. Anyway, my grandfather was called to be on duty. He was walking his beat. In the meantime, 3 crooks, robbers, came up from Chicago and had scoped out the offices of the American Brass. And they got into the building, tied up the night watchman, blew the safe, and carted off a lot of government bonds. I mean, I can't remember the figure. It was to the tune of $50,000 worth of bonds. I can't remember the monetary figure. But they made their escape to Sheridan Road, where they commandeered a cab. By the cabbie, whose name was Gunnar Hansen, and ordered him to drive them to Zion, I think. He had an idea that, he said, the Pinkerton account, which I've read, has some different facts. He said he knew that Officer Pingitore was having his lunch. It was his lunch break at the Sheridan Road garage, and told the guys that he was almost out of gas. You know, he better go get gas. Spun around, went back to the Sheridan Road garage, and the eyewitness accounts say that Earl Loveday, who was the shooter, had Gunnar Hansen with a gun in his back. They came into the office. My grandfather saw, understood, and began to pull his service revolver and was shot. And then they made their escape to Arkansas, to Florida. I mean, and eventually the Chief Owen O'Hare pursued them with vengeance and got them back, you know, so.
Okay, so the title of the book?
Well, the street names were, in Kenosha, were originally names. Market Street, Howland Avenue, and Garden Street. And Garden Street was 54th Street. Eventually, my grandmother was impoverished after my grandfather was killed. And there was an effort to get her a house. And it took a while, but influential folks in Kenosha got together, had a fundraising, and the city did well by her. You know, at least got her a house. 2212 54th Street. It was the Pingitore house really up until, you know, I had to sell the house. I was the executor, which we wanted to keep it, but wasn't going to work. Yeah, so my last aunt living in the house was Jenny, and when she passed, we sold the house. So
Okay. And what is the focus of the book, since the title is A House on Garden Street, but we're talking about the murder of a Kenosha police officer. So what's the focus of the book?
mostly my grandmother and my aunts and uncles and my dad. My dad was the baby. He was only 18 months old when my grandfather was killed. So the focus really, the first part of the book, maybe the first fifth, it isn't a major portion of the book, the murder and the pursuit, but it was how they survived and the help they received from some unlikely sources sometimes, and I guess the love that they displayed for one another, you know, to make it through this difficult time.
So the book kind of is running parallel. It has your grandmother and her children and what they're going through along the next year, I believe. And at the same time, there's a theme of the pursuit, capture, conviction of the three robbers.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Your cousin did this obviously on purpose. How does this thread that you see in here work well?
Well, I think he's done a nice job in putting flesh on these characters. You know, my aunt, it's really told from the view of my Aunt Mary, his mom. You know, she's the principal character in the book, really, and I think he does a nice job of weaving that all together. And you know, there's been interest in Kenosha, you know, to read the book. When Joey had the first run, he only had about 7 or 8 copies made. I mean, he really wasn't sure that there would be that much interest. I actually went to visit my Aunt Jenny, at the house, and a copy of the book was sitting on the table. Now, you got to remember, I guess, Jenny was in her 80s by that time, I think early 80s. And I said, Aunt Jen, where did you get this book? She said, Joey sent that to me. And I went, oh, it looks great. She was like, take it. You know, I don't think she really wanted to read it. So I took it and read it and called Joe and gave him accolades on it. And he sent me another copy. I had one extra copy, and I said to myself, what do I do with this? Who can I give it to that perhaps would generate some interest? I thought of Howard Brown, you know, and I didn't know Howard that well, I guess. And I ended up giving it to John Husmanic because John had done so much research that contributed to, you know, the book itself. And John helped get it going. You know, I'm not sure who he talked to. Julie Ventura, I know, because I talked to Julie Ventura about it. But anyway, that's when Joe decided to have another run and had some book signings at Tenuta's and at Andrea's. And, you know, the Kenosha History Center sold it, and Andrea's sold it. Tenuta's didn't sell it, but had book signings there. Ralph was a big supporter, Ralph Tenuta.
Did any of your uncles, your dad, and the other aunt talk about the book?
No. My dad had already passed. I'm trying to think. Aunt Jenny was the last survivor. My Aunt Viola had she had gotten some dementia, and you know, so no, my Aunt Jenny didn't really look too interested. She didn't seem too interested, unfortunately. And I think it was just age.
Okay. So your Uncle Frank, who was the oldest of the children?
Yes.
Okay. And he was how old when your grandfather was killed?
13.
And what did he need to do at that time, at 13-year-old boy, after his father's killed?
He had to become the father figure to his 7 siblings, help my grandmother.
What did he do?
Well, he got a job in a local grocery store and did that for a season. One of the stories we didn't know much about was the fact that he was hired then as a police officer. I would surmise in the early 20s at some point.
Which
And
would have put him at what age?
pardon me?
What age would he have been in the early 20s if he was 13 in 1919?
Yeah, maybe mid 20s then would be better, you know.
Still, he's
yeah.
only
Yeah.
18, 19 maybe?
Yep. And you know, the chief of police at the time was Thad Logan. Thad Logan had been a colleague of my grandfather's, you know, prior to becoming chief. So Thad Logan hired him to be a police officer. And he was serving then as a police officer until September of 1929, when his brother, my Uncle Peter, was killed, hit by a train, 43rd Street. You know, he was traveling. He was a musician. He had a couple of banjos. He was a banjo player. He and his girlfriend and a friend and his girlfriend were traveling down 43rd Street going east, and they were hit by a train. And the tragedy is my Uncle Frank was the first officer on scene and had to identify my Uncle Peter. And after that point, my grandmother said to him, I can't lose another child, another member of my family. So she encouraged him to quit the police department. And he spent his life then, my recollections are, going to Connolly's grocery store on 22nd Avenue. My Uncle Frank was a butcher and was good friends with George Connolly, and was a butcher in Kenosha until his retirement. Passed away about 1973, unfortunately.
And
So,
your dad?
my dad, again, was the baby. He became a steam fitter, apprenticed at Nash, became a pipe fitter, and eventually worked most of his life in northern Illinois as a journeyman there. We moved out of the 22nd or the 54th Street house when I was 6, and a friend tore down a house somewhere in Kenosha and built a new house on 30th Avenue. And we moved there, I believe, about 1956, right around there.
And your aunts, what did they do with their lives? Did they marry? Did they have a career?
Mary, of course, married Joe Gallo Sr. Joe was always loved California. Got a job there, I think, during the war in California, in a plant out there, and moved Mary and the kids after starting a family in Kenosha. Moved Mary and the kids there. So they were our California relatives. Peter, of course, was taken early, 20 years old, 19 or 20 years old. Jenny worked for Dr. Peckus, and later on at Mac's Canteen, you know, she had small jobs. Margaret went to the College of Commerce and became an executive secretary and worked for somewhere at Nash and then AMC. I don't want to miss now. I don't want to miss any of them. Rose married a fellow by the name of Guy Cagliotti, my Uncle Guy. And Rose, when I was growing up, she managed the Washington Park golf course. And I have fond recollections of taking the Orange Line from the south side of Kenosha to go play golf for a quarter and have a malt afterwards. You know, she took care of us. Viola married my Uncle Dan Goodwin, and she worked for a while for, she worked for Davis Heating. I remember her working for Davis Heating as a secretary. She worked for CJW, I think. Pepe Madrigrano's one of his outfits. And then later on, she was a secretary at the Kenosha Museum downtown. So and then she retired, you know. Okay. So good Kenosha people, all, you know.
Now, the picture on the cover of the book doesn't have Rose or Viola in it. It only has the 5 children. Your father's not in it. He was
right.
So, where are Rose and Viola at the time the photo was taken?
Not born yet.
Okay.
So the picture was early. There is no picture of the entire family with my grandfather. Later on, after my grandfather was killed, there is a picture of the family without him. And someone, with all the good intentions, put together a large photo superimposing my grandfather in the background. My grandmother never hung that picture. It troubled her. She just didn't want to have anything to do with it. It ended up in a closet upstairs, and I don't remember what we did with it, but she never hung it, you know. It just was bothersome to her, so.
And what did you do with your life? How did you grow up after moving to 76th Street?
Well, I became a South Sider. You know, of course, that there are those distinctions. But, you know, I always was in the Columbus Park area too. Did a lot of bike riding back and forth, serving Mass at Mount Carmel, visiting my grandmother. Anyway, I watched the South Side grow along 30th Avenue. Got a job as a Kenosha newsboy at 12, and that was my route, 30th Avenue from 29th Avenue. Well, it was from 75th Street south to 80th and then back. So did that for a while. Then got a job at Lakeside Foods, which was a fish market, the fishery that was in the old Odelberg grocery store neighborhood, where Casey Family Options is now. That was Lakeside Foods. So worked there for a while.
And where did you go to school?
I was, of the 5 of my 4 siblings, I was the only one who was sent to parochial school.
Was there a reason for you going to parochial school?
Not that I was never asked. I guess I was asked. I was little, so I was sent to St. James downtown. Had a good education there from grades 1 through 8. I went to kindergarten at Bain and preschool at the Mount Carmel preschool that was run at the Mount Carmel parish. But Mount Carmel didn't have a school, so they sent me to St. James. Took the Red Line back and forth to school, and then went to St. Joe's and graduated in '69. And from there, drifted a bit. I knew I wanted to be a teacher, but didn't jump into college right away with a lot of vigor. Ended up getting a job at American Brass worked there for about a year and a half, and then worked at Sullivan and Becker Machine Shop for a while as a production worker, and then I decided to go back to school. And I finished up my degree in history with a certificate in education. I wanted to teach history at the secondary level, but I was discouraged from that by the advisors and the education department, saying there just aren't a lot of jobs. And they said they're always looking for men at the elementary level. So when I finished my education there, I had a state license to teach grades 1 through 8, and I got a job in Genoa City, Wisconsin, at Brookwood School, teaching third and fourth grade, and then being a baseball coach there, softball coach for a while. 1 year, and then an opportunity presented itself for me to get hired at Roosevelt School in Kenosha. So I took a position there as a basically fourth and fifth grade teacher for about 8 years. And then, like most teachers need to, at least back then, needed to pursue a master's degree, because that's how you advance on the salary scale. And so I pursued a degree in administration and was hired as a principal at Prairie Lane School in '85. Spent 5 years there, and then took over Jane Vernon Elementary for 9 years, and then moved to Jeffrey for 8 or 9 years, and then retired, and then got called back to brass for a year, and then supervised student teachers through Cardinal Stritch for a while, and did some mentoring, and it was a great career. So.
Okay, so how do you see education from when you first started to today? Do you have any feelings about that?
Much harder to be a teacher today, much harder. More challenges in terms of discipline, challenges in terms of, mental illness on the part of a lot of young people today. Breakdown of the family, lack of support.
So you were hired as a principal in Kenosha. How did that job come about? How did the district fill those positions generally?
I would say wisely. I really did not have a tremendous amount of motivation to become a principal. I hadn't really given it a whole lot of thought. I was a contented teacher. I loved teaching. I looked forward to every new school year. Always had to get summer work because the checks would stop in June and they wouldn't start up until September. So took odd jobs every summer. But I was approached by my principal at the time, Rich Boss, and he said that there was going to be a meeting at Bradford because the administration at the time, it would have been John Osmanic and Ralph Houghton, probably primarily, they were projecting openings, administrative openings, school principal openings, over the next 10 years. They had that in their mind. And they had approached all the principals saying, if you have teachers on your staff that, first of all, seem to have an interest in administration, are capable as teachers and demonstrating some success as a teacher, we invite you to this meeting because we want to talk with you about future openings. At the same time, UW-Milwaukee had developed a consortial program with the Parkside campus and was bringing a program in administration, a master's program in administration, to the Parkside campus. So I determined to go get a master's degree, first of all. But secondly, I was intrigued by administration, I guess, and I finished up my master's then in 1985, August of 1985, and I had taken some time off from my summer job to paint my house. So I was out painting, and the phone rang, and it was Rich Boss, and he said, "Pete, Prairie Lane is opening up. Are you going to apply?" And I went, "I don't know." I guess so. So I put my application in and went through the interview process and was selected. So that began my administrative career.
Did the process of hiring teachers, from your recollection at the time you started to when you retired, change? Was it a different kind of process at all?
Back when I was a young principal, my first few years, the district was using a tool for hiring called the teacher perceiver, the SRI teacher perceiver. All of us as administrators at the time received training from SRI. It was a series of 60 questions that you would ask a candidate, or you could do the shortened version, 30 questions. And it attempted to get at, there were 9 themes that the questions surrounded. One I know was mission. You asked the candidate, do you believe teaching is more important than other professions? And you're looking for the candidate who says, yes, I believe teaching is more important than other professions. And then you ask why, of course, because you're making a difference. Other questions had to do with the other themes. Empathy. Do you have the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person and have empathy for them? Because if you do, you'll have empathy for your students. How organized are you? Are you well organized? Yes, I'm well organized, you know the answer. But you're looking for the candidate that says, but I'm flexible with my students, you know. I mean, wonderful, wonderful questions. They appealed to me as someone who was hiring. They appealed to me as a teacher, too. I guess I thought it's trying to get at someone's heart rather than teaching skills.
Do you know if they were using that when you retired?
Well, they had moved to an online series of questions that I suspect were similar. Not the same, similar. I was never a big believer in the online questions. I preferred to look a candidate across the table and ask those questions and try to get a sense for who they were.
Did you hire your own staff as a principal? Your own teachers, your own?
Yes. The central office at the time, the Human Resources Department, would go through an initial screening and then recommend candidates to us if we had openings. So,
and was
yes.
that the same when you were first a principal to when you retired, or did that change?
I guess it was the same. Yeah, it was the same. Well, now I have to backtrack on that. Over the years, there became more of an interest in including parents in the interview process and staff. So the process became more involved in terms of how to schedule and get a candidate in for a 20-minute interview back-to-back with another candidate, maybe 2 or 3 candidates. So it became more hasty, I think. I don't think as effective. I guess I preferred to hire my own staff. Sounds selfish, but you know.
Would you do it again?
Do what?
teach, be a principal?
Absolutely, in a heartbeat. It's wonderful work. I can't tell you I enjoyed being a principal more than I enjoyed being a teacher. You know, they're both equally very satisfying. So,
Thank you for sharing your family story with me.
thank you, Carl. Appreciate it.